Good evening. Good evening. Tonight we are going to be talking about the Waco Siege, or the Waco Massacre, as many people know. And I'm talking about this because it's part of the whole Ruby Ridge thing also. And I did the video on Ruby Ridge, which is linked down in the description below if you haven't seen that. This took place roughly 8 months after the siege on Ruby Ridge. And as we're going to see here, especially more towards the end of this video, um, the FBI, the ATF, they certainly did not learn from their mistakes. And in many instances, the main problem is that they don't see them as mistakes. And that came a lot because you could see the justification after the fact, and there was just no real remorse for what had happened. And so the Waco Siege took place in February of 1993, or it started, I should say, in February 1993, and it ran until April 19th, 1993. And again, this was only roughly 8 months after the siege on Ruby Ridge. And the main figure when you're talking about the Waco Siege is David Koresh, also known as Vernon Howell. So David Koresh was the head of the Branch Davidians, and he was their post-Christ figure. So the Branch Davidians, just to give you guys some context on this, the Branch Davidians are a break-off from the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And some of the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church that differ from other sects of Christianity, one of them is that they believe that the dead are not with Christ until his second coming, and they don't believe that hell is infinite torture, and they tend to avoid certain foods for health reasons. There are many Seventh-day Adventists that are vegans, vegetarians, whatnot. And the Davidians, the Branch Davidians, believed that God had visited his people with the living prophet for the second time. So they believe that Christ's second coming has happened. And this was all started by a man named Victor Hotef, who moved his family to Waco during the 1930s. And they focused really heavily on the cryptic 7 seals that can be found in Revelation in the Bible. Now, Hotef died in 1949, and 5 years after that, so in 1954, the Davidians gathered at Mount Carmel because they believed that the end was close. And this was according to prophecy, according to the Branch Davidians. So the Davidian church almost completely dissipated after the end did not come, but a small number stayed with the church. Vernon Howell was an understudy in the church, and a man by the name of George Roden split the church with Howell. So Roden compared it to a holy jihad. The majority of the Davidians backed Howell, but they got chased off to Palestine, Texas, where they lived in buses and tents. After an armed confrontation between Roden and Howell, Howell was declared the leader of the Branch Davidians. After Vernon Howell returned from a trip to Israel, he legally changed his name to David Koresh, honoring the biblical King David, and Koresh is a reference to what he believed to be the Messiah Koresh mentioned in the book of Isaiah. And it's important to note that in the King James Version, the translation is Cyrus, not Koresh. Koresh is the Hebrew word for Cyrus. And Cyrus was a king mentioned over 30 times in the Bible because it was under his rule that the Jews were allowed to return to Israel after 70 years of captivity. Cyrus was anointed by God to subdue nations. So David Koresh did not believe he was Christ. This is something of a misunderstanding of who the Branch Davidians were. David Koresh did not believe that he was Christ, but he promised to be a final Christ figure, an anointed one. He believed that he was the 7th seal mentioned in the book of Revelation. Now, before we get into the actual events of Waco, it is important to address something that is perhaps one of the more widespread claims about the Branch Davidians. There was allegedly the practice of polygamy, underage women marrying David. Celibacy was seen as the way for the group, but this final figure supposedly had the obligation to beget 24 children. Now, the claim of minor abuse at the compound is very heavily disputed because the only witness to testify regarding the abuse was Kiri Jewell, and her story seemed to change a couple times, and it was a bit inconsistent. And it doesn't mean at all that it wasn't happening, but we can manage to get off into the weeds a little bit talking about this because regardless, the raid on the compound was regarding firearms. And if they wanted to take down Koresh for child abuse, they should have gotten evidence of that. And I did notice something interesting watching quite a few of the hearings regarding Waco. And not that I would necessarily try to make this a partisan issue, but I couldn't help but notice that it was rather highly partisan. The Democrats immediately tried to paint the entire Waco siege as something that was entirely across the board justified. Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden led the charge on a lot of this. And Democrats did the same exact thing with Ruby Ridge. They tried to make it sound like the ATF and the FBI were entirely in the right. And the Democrats actually called Kiri Jewell as a witness because they believed that her testimony would help to exonerate the ATF and the FBI, simply because people don't care about the justification for the siege like it was okay because Koresh was supposedly a pedo. But in reality, Kiri's testimony is important. It's worth trying to get corroborating witnesses on, but it's 100% irrelevant to the error of Waco. Okay, and for the record, they did try to get corroborating witnesses. The Department of Human Services went out to interview children, and to this day, they have absolutely no case that can be made against David Koresh in terms of abusing minors. Most of the girls in question on the compound, too, this is worth mentioning, most of the girls in question were 14 years old, and a 14-year-old can get married with parental consent. So if their parents allowed it to happen, then there's nothing that the law can do about it. And I'm not saying it's right, but there's nothing that the law can do about it. Now, 2/3 of the search warrants for the compound were regarding statutory rape, when the ATF has absolutely no jurisdiction whatsoever over those offenses. And the ATF said that they were making machine guns in the compound, and they went to seize those weapons because they believed that the Branch Davidians were a threat to the surrounding community, and a lot of the blame for that was because of their religious views. Now, the Branch Davidians also, they had 48 illegal weapons, supposedly, on their property on April 19th, when the search warrant was executed between February 28th and April 19th, 1993. And you'll see why I say they supposedly had 48 illegal weapons on their property. We'll get more into that here towards the end of this video. But whether or not they had the machine guns put together on February 28th when the raid started, I mean, that's a matter that's subject to great dispute. As far as people knew, the Branch Davidians only had the capability to make machine guns, which for people who know firearms, that's not saying a lot, to say that they had the capability to make machine guns. So it's thought that they made the machine guns after the raid started. And they also mentioned grenades that the compound had, but the only grenades, which were flashbangs really, that were found on the property belonged to the ATF. And during this whole siege, the Branch Davidians never used grenades. So where that claim came from is up to speculation. But Chuck Schumer, old Chucky, tried arguing that flashbangs are perfectly safe, despite an ATF special agent testifying that they are classified as destructive devices and they have the ability to kill people. In fact, law enforcement will use flashbangs to kill suspects without injuring law enforcement. So on top of that, the search warrant for firearms was put together with very prejudiced witnesses, and the ATF was sloppy in the procedure. They misstated the statute number, and there were some other technical errors in the warrant. And when you have something that's inflammatory and then something that's sloppy, it means that the warrant was rushed with a bias. So there was the retired ATF Deputy Director, Robert Sanders, who said that the manner in which the raid was cobbled together and then conducted, so going by their actions alone, it showed that the ATF was really just trying to make a publicity stunt. And it was a lot of the same thing with Ruby Ridge, even though at this point you have to remember this was like 8 months after Ruby Ridge. They had something to prove. They had, their tarnished name that they were trying to build back up. But again, the same thing can be said about the siege on Ruby Ridge. And I even mentioned that in my Ruby Ridge video, again, linked below if you're interested. And you also had a press person for the ATF and an ATF special agent contacting news outlets before the raid to tell them that something huge was about to happen in Waco, Texas. And that, again, further bolsters the idea that this was for publicity, especially when it's admitted that there was ample time to report on the story after the raid had already been concluded. Plus, during the raid, they had communication lines set up for the press to report in real time, but trying to call emergency services after people had been shot, that was something they had not streamlined. So they streamlined something for the press, but not for emergency services. Basically, it was quite the task to get emergency services up to Mount Carmel, but the communication lines were put in place for the press to immediately report on everything happening. So, one was clearly more important than the other here. And prior to the raid, the ATF trained for 3 days in Fort Hood, Texas, on the military's dollar, telling the military that it was training for a massive drug raid when it was never a drug raid. Why the military didn't question the ATF training for a drug raid, that's another question worth asking. And there's no evidence at all that there were drugs present or used in the compound. And again, going back to the fact that these people broke off from the Seventh-day Adventist Church, Seventh-day Adventists, from what I was able to find, tend to be careful with what they're eating, what they're putting in their body. So it doesn't even make sense on a religious level to, think that they would be using drugs on the compound. So basically in this compound, you had white people, black people, old people, children, men, women, perfectly fine people. They weren't your criminal type at all. Again, you had old people, you had children, women, you had families living on this compound. Again, not your criminal type at all. The FBI actually gave them a video camera during the siege so that they could talk a bit about themselves. And it was so wholesome and personal that the FBI initially withheld the tapes from the public because they thought that the tapes would win sympathy points for David Koresh. And as you'll see here as we go through this, a lot of the media coverage around this was very, very distorted, and a lot of the congressional testimony. There were lies after lies, contradictions, misstatements. It was remarkable. And there's even instances, as we'll get into here, where, the FBI lies about something and then they show a videotape right after that shows that the FBI just lied. Anyway, where do the guns come in with all of this? Well, it was a prophecy around Mount Carmel since 1934 that called for an ultimate confrontation between God's people and an armed apostate called Babylon. Because of this, they took an interest in weapons and ammunition and stockpiling, and they soon found that there was a lot of money to be made at gun shows, so they bought and sold. The press says that they stockpiled weapons like that's some terrible thing, and perhaps for the Branch Davidians, it had multiple utilities, and especially when this siege was going on, yeah, it had multiple utilities. But all gun dealers stockpile weapons. A firearms dealer from Waco even said that all of the guns that the compound was buying would go up in value without question, indicating they really were an investment rather than a stockpile for nefarious purposes. And besides, the FBI even admitted that stockpiling is not a crime. They can stockpile weapons and ammunition. Now, on the morning of February 28th, law enforcement had blocked traffic to and from Mount Carmel while the raid team suited up miles away. And just for reference here, okay, this is what the compound looked like before the raid. So, I mean, it was all interconnected. There were several different buildings, but again, all interconnected. And, you know, when it comes to this, the Davidians were tipped off about the raid only about 30 minutes before it started. And it was because the media showed up. And again, because this was supposed to be a big press event for the ATF and the FBI. So there was an ATF undercover agent who arrived at the command post, and he started yelling that the raid should be called off because the Davidians knew that they were coming. So they lost the element of surprise. Helicopters were initially flying around the back of the compound to try to divert the Davidians' attention so that ATF agents could move in from the front. And again, this was after the element of surprise had been lost, so they were trying to regain that by diverting their attention with helicopters. So the ATF, to this day, asserts that the Davidians shot first. The only problem with that is that it makes no sense for the Davidians to wait for the ATF agents to roll up in nothing but cattle cars with tarps over them, get into positions, spread out behind cover, and then open fire on them. If the Davidians were going to take out the ATF by shooting first, it would have made far more sense to go for them when they were basically fish in a barrel in the back of those cattle cars. I mean, they were absolutely defenseless back there. Also, the doors that the ATF asserts the Branch Davidians started shooting through, nearly every single round through those double doors was incoming from the outside of the compound in. So Congress asked for a videotape of when the shooting started, and the videotape was blank. They asked for the doors initially shot through, and the doors are missing. There was a group of ATF agents that were at the front of the compound, and the Davidians had some animals there, mostly dogs, including puppies, and the ATF agents further bolstered their name by shooting all of the animals in cold blood. That's how they started out. Now, the law is very clear with this, okay? If there's an arrest by officers, that arrest can be resisted legally if the agents use excessive force before anything else happens. Now, the first 15 to 20 minutes of the raid were basically just for show. I mean, it was, just setting up, making the ATF look good, and, watching them storm the compound, fire on the compound, and then people started dropping dead. And there's also a lot of reason to believe that there was gunfire coming from the helicopters up above. In fact, there was a 17-year-old Davidian who was shot from a helicopter, and he was just trying to climb to the top of a silo. He was completely unarmed. He was just trying to see what was going on, and he was shot on top of the silo. And the ATF and the FBI, whatnot, would not let the Davidians recover his body for 5 days. And even after all of this, the Davidians were hesitant to fire back. In the 911 calls, the Davidians are saying that there's women and children in this compound that the ATF is just randomly firing on, and the gunfire sounds that you could hear in the background on the 911 call, the Davidians were saying that that's not coming from us, that's coming from them. And even when the Davidians called 911, the 911 operator wasn't able to reach the ATF. They weren't getting a radio response. Now, after 2 hours, the ATF agents called a truce because they were out of ammunition. At this point, the Davidians could have killed every single ATF agent on the property. They had far more ammunition than the agents, and they, excuse me, and their firearms were far more powerful than the ATF agents. But once the agents said that they'd leave the property, the Davidians stopped shooting. I mean, there were 4 ATF agents killed on the first day here, and the Davidians were acquitted of murder and conspiracy to commit murder because it was self-defense. 2 Davidians died on that first day also, one of which was thought to be shot from the helicopter, or actually I should say both of which were thought to be shot from the helicopter, one on top of the silo and one in one of the buildings in a room. The assistant U.S. attorney at the time advised them to stop the shooting review. Okay, so after something like this, the ATF compiles a shooting review where they go through what happened. And the assistant U.S. attorney told them to stop doing the shooting review, which again is standard procedure after an event like this. And it was because they were creating exculpatory evidence. They were creating what's called Brady material. They were creating documents that would make the Davidians look justified in what they did. And it didn't help either that the news reported that 3 Branch Davidians tried to escape by shooting their way past ATF agents. That story was entirely false, entirely 100% false. ATF agents actually just killed a father in cold blood who was 350 yards away from the compound. Now, the FBI negotiator on the phone with David Koresh initially said that the helicopters did not fire on the compound. This is all like within a few seconds on the same audio tape, okay? Initially, the FBI negotiator said that the helicopters did not fire on the compound. David got upset at that. He called him a liar and then said that there was absolutely gunfire from the helicopters. Then the FBI negotiator said, well, there were no mounted guns on the helicopters, but I'm not disputing the fact that there was gunfire from the helicopters. Then the FBI negotiator admitted that the agents on the helicopters had guns. So there were guns on the helicopters, and the FBI negotiator could not say that they didn't fire on the compound, even after trying to convince the Davidians that there was no gunfire coming from the helicopters. Now, on March 1st, the ATF handed control of this whole situation over to the FBI, because that sounds like a good move. The FBI snipers were placed in key positions where they could essentially gun down anyone trying to leave the compound, and the entire compound was surrounded by agents. The FBI negotiator talking to Koresh admitted that the decisions on what was happening were coming from D.C., just a little bit over 1,400 miles away. The FBI also said that Koresh said that he'd peacefully come out of the compound 5 different times, but when people began asking for those negotiation tapes, nothing in there shows Koresh saying that he'd come out. The only instance of something like this happening was on March 2nd. Koresh said that he was going to come out, but God told him to wait. The person in charge of drawing up the psychological profile on Koresh, because we saw this, remember, in Ruby Ridge, they drew up a psychological profile on the father, Randy Weaver, and it was just completely off the rails. It made no sense, and it led to a very over-militarization of the situation. Well, the person in charge of drawing up the psychological profile for David Koresh said that a cautious, non-confrontational approach was the best path forward, and this was advised to FBI officials between March 3rd and March 8th. FBI superiors then pressured him to recommend a more confrontational approach. In light of all of this, agents began playing loud noises at night with bright lights to keep the Davidians up. So they were trying to take people that they said were mentally unstable, and they tried to make them more mentally unstable by refusing to allow them to sleep. Many of the agents also acted very childish. This was kind of embarrassing to see video footage of this. Many of the agents acted very childish. They were flipping the finger to the compound, mooning them, messing around in tanks and other large vehicles, just having fun with it. And the Davidians also buried one of their own outside of the compound, and the tanks repeatedly ran over the grave time and time again on purpose. And the Davidians took that kind of personally. They saw that as very, very disrespectful. These agents knew what they were doing. The Davidians were convinced at this point that the agents were not humane, and if the Davidians were as crazy, cultish, and irrational as they were trying to make them sound to the media, why did they have to act the way that they did, both in terms of their childish behavior, but also the tactics that they used to keep them from sleeping? It's like, if they're actually as cultish and crazy and irrational as you're trying to make them sound, why do you have to keep pushing their psychological boundaries, trying to make them more unstable? It just doesn't make a lot of sense. And keep in mind too, going back to it, the people in this compound, perfectly fine, normal people, and you had people from many backgrounds, and there were even people who traveled from other countries to come and live in this compound. So the next step in all of this was when the FBI had someone investigate if there's a fire extinguisher in the compound. The investigator said that there was only one, and the FBI's response was that they better buy some fire insurance. You're going to see a lot of ominous things like that the FBI says. Quite a few of the people in the compound, primarily children and the elderly, were free to leave, except the adults that left were promptly brought to jail. They had 70, 80-year-old women being put in a jail cell, telling them that they would be perfectly safe if they left the compound. Now, the Davidians at this point hung a banner outside one of the windows saying, "FBI broke negotiations, we want press." And when they brought in Koresh's grandmother to try to convince him to surrender peacefully, one of the FBI agents said, "I hope she has told him goodbye." That was federal law enforcement who was guarding the gates to the compound. That's their mindset. So it's almost like they knew what they were going to do before they actually did it. And it wasn't just like, it wasn't this completely rational plan to get people out alive and seize the weapons they were looking for and bring it to trial and then have it go to an appeals court, make sure that the trial was done, justly. No, this was shoot first, ask questions later. Now on April 14th, that was a very significant day because the tides started to look like they were going to turn. David Koresh wrote a letter that ended up in the hands of the FBI that said that he was working on his interpretation of the 7 biblical seals in Revelation, and that everyone inside of the compound was convinced they did not have to die now, and this was not the time for that end times prophecy to be fulfilled. And something very interesting too, because we saw very, very ridiculous rules of engagement for the FBI at Ruby Ridge. And the FBI rules of engagement at Waco were that they wouldn't shoot unless someone's life was in danger. We're going to see them break those rules of engagement multiple times. And Janet Reno was the U.S. Attorney General at the time, and she said that the FBI negotiator said that they think that they've reached an impasse where nobody else was coming out peacefully. The negotiators were lying, blatantly lying. They knew that David Koresh was working on the 7 seals and that the first seal was finished. And to get proof of it, they even sent in a typewriter so that they could have the proof in their hands. And the very next morning, they launched the tear gas and tank attack. That was the morning of April 19th, 1993, day 51. So this was day 51 of the siege. To give you an idea of what Janet Reno authorized to be used against the Davidians, okay? Boot camp trainees are briefly exposed to a very mild amount of tear gas for just a few seconds, just so they know what it feels like. The Davidians received 10 times that amount for more than 6 hours. This gas can cause unconsciousness, death, and it's highly flammable. When it burns, it creates hydrogen cyanide. That's the same poison used in prison gas chambers. The FBI knew that the Branch Davidians did not have gas masks that could be fitted to the children, and they knew that there were still elders in the compound with respiratory issues. And given the duration of this gas attack, those gas masks fail at a certain point. And there were FBI agents who even said that those gas masks have to be failing by this point. Like, they knew what they were trying to do. Agents also had the means to fire rounds of the gas into the compound. And this basically came through something that looked somewhat like a grenade launcher. And on the label of the projectile that they were shooting with the gas, it says to not fire it directly at people because it will kill them. So agents not only shot the gas into every single window of the compound, but if they saw movement, they targeted the movement. Janet Reno went on to say that the tanks that they were using were unarmed, and she even said they were like a good rent-a-car from the military, trying to make light of a very serious situation. These gas and tank attacks started early in the morning of April 19th. At 9 a.m. on April 19th, Janet Reno left the command center at FBI headquarters to give a speech in Baltimore. And then all decisions from that point on were made by top Clinton officials and the FBI. Now, the question was posed to Reno in the congressional hearings. Why would you not cancel your speech in Baltimore so you could stay at the command center when she knew that only 4 minutes into their plan, they had gas in every window and tanks storming the compound? Janet Reno's response was that the FBI did not want her to cancel that speech because they thought that it would alarm the public about what was happening. After all of this, there was basically no accountability within the Department of Justice. And just because I'm going to be talking about the Department of Justice and the Department of the Treasury, ATF is part of the Department of the Treasury. FBI is part of the Department of Justice. So that's why, at the end of all of this, both of those departments issued separate reports on what happened at Waco. So just for context on that. Now, it was at 9 a.m., remember, on April 19th, that Janet Reno left the command center. At 11:16 a.m., there was a tank that approached the rear of the compound. Now, the rear of the compound was the side that the media could not see. So the media was already very far from the compound. They already could not get a good view of what was going on. But they could not see at all what was going on the backside of the compound. So a tank approached the rear of the compound. And thermal imaging from a plane that was overhead, a surveillance plane, recorded the tank firing rounds into the compound. And it wasn't tank rounds, it was machine gun fire. But during the congressional hearing, the FBI asserted they did not fire a single round at the compound. And this was when they then brought up the thermal imaging footage showing the automatic gunfire coming from the tank into the compound. The tank then smashed into the backside of the compound while firing rounds at 11:24 a.m. And they took out an entire chunk of the building. So the FBI said in the congressional hearings that they were trying to create holes in the compound so that they could have something of an entranceway. And you're going to see in a minute here why that's not the only reason they were trying to create holes. But what this tank did in the back of the compound was not just a hole. This was taking out, the back side of a building, and the entire back side. So there was a private group called Infraspection, and they look at infrared footage to determine what's going on. And they confirmed that there were rounds fired from the tank into the compound. And perhaps more chilling, they said that there were either people entering, exiting, or being run over by an armored vehicle. But then they suddenly just declined to comment further because they thought that the repercussions from that would be very negative. And they thought that it was material that was a bit too sensitive. They ended up finding 5 bodies a bit further into the building from where the tank smashed through, and all 5 of those bodies were heavily mutilated, not just gunshot wounds. It was almost like they had been run over by a tank. Around 11:34 a.m., so about 10 minutes after the tank smashed into the building, something happened which caused the tank's tread to come off. And for anybody who knows anything about tanks, when the tread comes off, that tank is just a sitting duck. It can't really move. It turns out that something, mostly red, had been caught in the front wheel. There was a body recovered that was mutilated that had only a small little piece of a red shirt around the wrist. The available evidence suggests that what got caught in the tank's wheel was one of the bodies crushed by the tank. And there was no damage report done on the tank, okay, which is a break from procedure because the tank became inoperable. Again, the tread fell off. You're supposed to do a damage report on that, and they didn't. So they never really examined and got any, official documentation on what happened with that tank. Now, as the gas in the tank attack continued, the women and children went to the safest place in Mount Carmel that was left, which was a storage room in the kitchen area. They didn't have gas masks, and the FBI bragged about being able to infiltrate the last safe haven with a tank and gas them. After this kind of gas attack in such a small area with no ventilation, it's thought that many of the women and children that were there went unconscious. Some died. Others were described as being possibly inert, which basically means you're alive, you're breathing, but you're not doing anything. You can't move. You're basically immobile. During this time, the tanks crushed a lot of propane and kerosene tanks that ended up saturating the floor of a section of the compound, multiple sections of the compound, and their vapor filled the air. The tanks were then used to rip holes in multiple sections of the compound, which, again, the FBI said that they were trying to do this to get better visuals and whatnot. They essentially turned the compound into a potbelly stove, okay? When you want a very slow, low-temp burn, you close the vents. When you want a fast, high-heat burn, you open the vents. The 25-mile-an-hour wind was able to whip through the entire compound at this point, from one end to the other. Less than a minute after the last tank finished dumping gas into the compound, again, highly flammable gas, the first of 3 separate fires started. And 2 other fires were started in other areas of the compound within a 3-minute period. So you had 3 fires separately started on the compound within 3 minutes of each other. 2 Davidian survivors both attest to seeing fireballs in separate areas of the compound. One traveled to the kitchen area, right next to where the women and children were gassed, and another raced to the rear of the compound, or raced, I should say, from the rear of the compound to the front of the compound. And it ignited everything in its path. What both of these fireballs have in common is that they were both seen within just moments of separate tanks pulling away from these initial fires in the building. And thermal imaging also captured what appears to be detonations inside the compound. Now, the Congressional Fire Investigation Panel, which I didn't even know existed, said that the flash was a sunlight reflection. Any idea what the problem with that might be? That it's a sunlight reflection? The footage was on thermal imaging, and specialists familiar with thermal imaging say that the Fire Investigation Panel's story makes no sense. You don't see sunlight reflection on thermal imaging, especially for as small a time period as it popped up on the thermal imaging. It would just not make any sense. The specialists agreed that it's much, much more consistent with detonation. And when you view the footage, it's not just one detonation. There's the way that it works is there's the initial charge that goes off that then ignites the actual explosive. And you can see on the thermal imaging both of those explosions. So again, you have to see here that many in the media, politicians, specifically Democrats, again, I'm not trying to make this partisan. Listen to the hearings and you will see that they made this partisan. Okay. Politicians, specifically Democrats, professional teams assessing the footage, the FBI, the ATF, and it wasn't all of the professional teams assessing the footage. It was just the ones that were involved with the government. But then the FBI, the ATF, they all tried very desperately to cover up what really happened at Mount Carmel. And the politicians in particular tried to make a lot of excuses. They tried to, just kind of shout over everybody else and just talk about how ridiculous it was that anybody would think that the ATF and the FBI were in the wrong. Made a lot of emotional arguments that really didn't stand up to any scrutiny. Luckily, there were enough people in the pursuit of truth here that all of these lies got exposed. The FBI and the media both reported that they did absolutely nothing that could have started a fire, even though one of the gas dispersion methods that the FBI used included pyrotechnics. So it was basically a canister fired from a handheld grenade launcher. They found evidence for that propellant, that pyrotechnic device, right near where the first fire had started. The FBI also admitted during the congressional hearings that they held up the firefighters and did not let them enter the compound because they didn't want the firemen to drive into gunfire. Even though every single recorded instance of gunfire from this point on was coming from outside of the building. At this point, most of the Davidians were trapped in the kitchen area, and they could have gotten out before being cooked alive if there were not two agents outside of the area laying down heavy machine gun fire on them. As soon as the Branch Davidians' flag burned and it floated away, as soon as it burned away from the flagpole and it fluttered away in the wind, and the fire in the building, by the way, was still going on at this point, the ATF very quickly hoisted their own flag up the flagpole, and they treated it as something of a conquest. And I'll show you guys in the aftermath here. Okay, so let me show you first of all. This is a tank. This is the gas dispersion method. It was literally just popping holes in the side of the building and spewing the gas in. And they did this in multiple areas, and they would use this same arm to rip much larger holes in the building to, again, create the potbelly stove effect. But this is what the compound looked like after the fire had completely finished. And you can see just a little bit in the very upper left-hand corner. Let me see if I can actually zoom in on this. So in the very upper left-hand corner, you can see you can see the Texas flag there. I believe that's the Texas flag. But right below it, there's a little blue flag. And I don't know if you guys can see that. There's a little blue flag below the Texas flag. That's the ATF flag. So the ATF put their flag up right after the Branch Davidians burned off. And there was still fire raging on parts of the compound at this point, like I said. So the FBI quickly got into the media and said that the parents of the Branch Davidian children clearly did not care enough about their children to leave peacefully. The FBI in many instances made the claim that they basically tried to make the conditions in the compound as bad as humanly possible so that they could force everybody out. When that didn't work, they just went with the scorched earth method. And remember, when the gas that they were pouring into this compound, when that gas burned, it created hydrogen cyanide. When that's inhaled, it actually contracts muscles so quickly that it can break bones. This was found in quite a few of the victims, including children. The county medical examiners were not given access to the bodies, and the FBI took possession of them. Nobody's been able to independently examine the bodies or the firearms that were supposedly illegal. There was somebody from the county medical examiner's office who was there to film the aftermath, and a ranger actually came up behind him and said, "You can't be doing that," and then asked for the tape. Eventually, the ranger got the tape because they promised to review it and return it the next day. They didn't. In fact, time went on and they eventually just said that the tape was lost. So there is no independent footage from the aftermath of all of this. And again, there was no attempt at all to put out the fire. No attempt at all to fight the fire. Janet Reno said that there's no doubt in her mind that every single fire set at the compound was set by the Branch Davidians. They even tried to make the case that the survivors smelled of accelerants, trying to make it sound like they were trying to light themselves on fire. The problem with that is that why didn't they all burn? I mean, if this is their plan, mass suicide, why did it not happen? And they also ignored the fact that these survivors, of which there were only a few, these survivors could only escape through a very narrow area, drenched in accelerants, left behind by the crushed fuel tanks. Like I said, there was no attempt whatsoever to put out the fire. And after it was out, the FBI began changing the crime scene, distorting the crime scene, and largely there were just a lot of breaks from procedure. Joe Biden himself, as a senator, even said that the Branch Davidians set fire to themselves and there was no improper intent or motivation from law enforcement. To try to equate this to a mass suicide event like Jonestown is just entirely false, completely false. There's no reason to think that other than the fact that the FBI and some politicians, including Joe Biden, Janet Reno, and Chuck Schumer, said that that's what this was. There's absolutely no evidence to support that. In the fall of 1993, the Treasury Department and the Department of Justice issued respective reports on Waco. Again, the ATF part of the Treasury, the FBI part of the DOJ. The Treasury said that the ATF blew it. The Department of Justice exonerated the FBI. So basically, one group took the blame, the other group got off free. Nothing really happened to either of them. Following the Waco Siege, the Treasury Department went on to make several contradictory statements, omissions, distortions, false statements. I mean, it was just riddled with errors. And there was also a charred copy of the Fourth Amendment that was found at Waco after the siege. The Fourth Amendment is the one that restricts or it grants people the right to not be unjustly searched and have possessions seized. It says the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. As a final note on all of this, because there were connections to Ruby Ridge, the FBI sniper who shot Vicki Weaver was also present at Waco. You had many of the same ATF and FBI agents and the same hostage rescue team commander. As I mentioned in the Ruby Ridge video, the hostage rescue team, it's this nice bubbly name, right? It sounds great, like you're trying to rescue the hostages. It's really just a government death squad. And they've proven this time and time again, that they're just a government death squad. Hostage rescue team, oddly similar to the American Rescue Plan. Funny that. So again, let me pull up a picture here. I'll recrop this here so you can see everything. So this is what the compound looked like at the end of everything, at the end of the siege. This is what it looked like. Again, absolutely no attempt whatsoever to fight that fire. And the FBI withheld firefighters from going and fighting the fire. Here's the tank pumping in gas, and here's the initial compound, the before and the after. So I think that does a good job covering everything that happened. I thank you guys so much for being here. It is a heartbreaking story, but it's something that we need to remember because the ATF and the FBI did not learn from this. The Department of Justice did not learn from this. The government did not learn from this in general. Joe Biden even said that the Branch Davidians killed themselves. Their government did not. I'd love to see somebody ask him a question on this now. Ask him how he feels about Waco, especially with his dementia. So, yeah, changing the Fourth Amendment. I mean, that's quite literally what it is. But what amendment at this point hasn't been changed? I mean, shall not be infringed means absolutely nothing. The community caretaking clause of the Fourth Amendment now applies to seizing firearms without a warrant. I mean, yeah. So, I mean, I really appreciate everybody tuning in. I know this isn't the easiest story to hear, but I do thank you guys for being here. I'll end this video now, but thank you guys very much for being here. I hope you have a great rest of your night. And I mean, I guess as a final note, just never trust your government, and never think that they're going to just out of their own nature act benevolent, because it's not going to happen. So thank you guys for being here, and I'll see you guys in the next one.